I arrived at the company party with a heart full of expectations. I hadn't warned anyone, I wanted to surprise, make that positive impact when I arrived. The room was filled with laughter and music, the lights flickered in warm tones that made the atmosphere more intimate. I walked among the guests, greeting colleagues, until, in the distance, my eyes stopped on a scene that made the air around me feel heavy. There was my wife, laughing and dancing with the boss. There was nothing extraordinary about seeing two colleagues dancing at a corporate event, but something about the way their bodies approached each other, the way their eyes met, made me uneasy. My heart started to beat faster, not because of the joy of finding her, but because of something that I didn't want to admit, but I knew was there, suffocating my reason. Before I could get any closer, they saw me. The look of surprise on her face was followed by a nervous smile. "We're just dancing, like good friends," she said, in a voice that sounded fake, like an actor unsure of herself in front of an audience. But I already knew. I knew everything. For months the distance between us had grown, almost imperceptibly at first, until it became impossible to ignore. She was more distracted, quieter, and avoided certain topics as if they were traps. I had no concrete evidence, just pieces of a story that still didn't make sense, messages quickly deleted, exits that weren't explained, changes in tone of voice when I received calls. "Do you trust me?" she asked that night, looking at me with teary eyes. I didn't respond. I just continued to watch as the boss, trying to maintain his composure, straightened his tie and walked away with an awkward smile. But at that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't just jealousy or the pain of imagining what could be happening, it was humiliation. The realization that, perhaps, I was the last to know the truth in a theater that everyone had already witnessed. The party was still around me, but it felt like the world had stopped for me. On the way back home, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I had confronted the evidence myself so many times, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Now everything seemed clear. I didn't need to hear any more excuses, I didn't need any more explanations. "Do you think I'm exaggerating?" My voice echoed in the empty car as I rehearsed a confrontation I knew I would have soon. Still, a part of me fought against what I knew to be true. I wanted to believe that there was a misunderstanding, that the closeness seen in the room was just a result of the relaxed atmosphere. When we arrived home, silence settled like a heavy cloud. She sat on the couch, crossing her arms and avoiding my gaze. "If there's something you want to say it now," I began, trying to control the anger that threatened to explode. She hesitated. His face was like a mask, struggling to maintain an expression of innocence while his eyes told a different story. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally replied, his voice sounding firm but with a slight tremble that I didn't miss. "Don't lie to me," I said, moving closer. "I know what's going on. I saw how he looks at you, I saw how you react when he's around. You don't have to pretend anymore." "It's all in your head," she insisted, but there was something in her voice that now sounded more defensive than genuine. That night we slept in silence. She in bed, me on the sofa, with my heart crushed by the weight of uncertainty. But in my mind, a decision was already beginning to form. I would no longer be the man who turned a blind eye to the evidence, who clung to the crumbs of a love that seemed to be falling apart. The following days were a dance of unspoken tensions. Every time she picked up her cell phone and left the room to answer a call, I felt a stab in my chest. Every time she casually mentioned the boss's name, it was as if she tested my patience. I needed answers. It was on one of these nights, after a long discussion that ended with no solutions, that she finally spilled the beans. "You think it's easy?" he shouted, his words filled with anger and pain. "Do you think I don't feel guilty about being attracted to someone who notices me, who compliments me, who makes me feel alive? So that's it?" I replied, my voice shaking with indignation. "You justify your choices because I don't make you feel the way I should? How can you blame someone for loving you, for giving their all while you choose to cheat?" She didn't respond. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. I left home that night, driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of it all. I loved that woman, but how can I trust her again? How to rebuild something that seemed so irreparably destroyed? And then came the unexpected. In the midst of chaos, when everything seemed lost, someone entered my life in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. It was not an attempt at substitution or escape, it was simply someone who reminded me what it feels like to be seen, heard, valued. Someone who didn't ask questions, but offered a presence that calmed the storm inside me. Now, looking back, I see that that moment at the party was not the end, but the beginning of something I could never have predicted. A journey that would lead me to choices that would test my strength, my resilience and, most of all, my heart. And as I reflect on all of this, there's still something I don't know: how will this story end? Can love survive such a devastating mistake? Or is there something bigger in store for me, something that only time can reveal? Welcome to our channel. Here, we in no way support any type of betrayal. All the stories you will hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and true loves. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of emotion and twists. Now, sit back and allow yourself to dive into a shocking story that will stir your feelings. Good story. The city lights shone softly through the windows of the small apartment where David and Clara lived. They had been married for almost 8 years, and although routine had become a constant companion, there was still something in the looks they exchanged that suggested the affection that had brought them together from the beginning. David, a methodical man with a passion for order and planning, worked as an analyst in a large company. His work routine was demanding, but he always made a point of making time for Clara. She, on the other hand, was an extroverted woman, full of energy and creativity, who had built a solid career as an event organizer. She had an easy smile and an impressive ability to transform ordinary situations into unforgettable moments. Despite their personality differences, the two always found ways to complement each other. David admired Clara's ability to bring color to his methodical life, while she appreciated the security and stability he offered. The relationship was balanced, but in recent months, something had changed. It wasn't something easy to point out. There were no obvious fights or arguments, just a slight tension that hovered between them, like a cloud that obscured the sun every now and then. David, naturally introspective, began to wonder if he was neglecting the relationship. He noticed Clara's prolonged silences, the smiles that seemed forced and the tiredness in her eyes. Is she unhappy? He thought, but never found the courage to ask directly. He went out of his way to please her, whether by preparing special dinners on the weekends or planning little surprises. But Clara always seemed distracted, as if his mind was far away, somewhere else he couldn't reach. Clara, in turn, felt a growing restlessness within her. Marriage, which had once seemed like a safe haven, now felt like she was stuck in a monotonous routine. She loved David, or at least she believed she still did, but she missed something she couldn't name. Maybe it was the excitement at the beginning of the relationship, or the freedom I felt before we replaced me. Her nights working at corporate events and parties kept her busy, but they also brought her into contact with people and situations that fed her restless mind. One night, while Clara was at another company event, David stayed at home organizing documents for an important meeting the next day. The house seemed quieter than usual, and he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that came over him when Clara was away. He looked at the picture frame on the table, a photo from their wedding. They were both smiling, radiant, on a sunny day that seemed perfect in every way. Where were we going wrong? He wondered. Clara returned late that night, exhausted but with a different energy. Something about her seemed renewed, and David noticed it. Was the event good? He asked, trying to capture something in her expression. Yes, it was great. Everything went as planned, Clara replied with a brief smile. But she didn't elaborate, and the conversation died there. The following days followed a similar pattern. David buried himself in work, trying to stave off his insecurities, while Clara seemed increasingly distant. He began to notice details that had previously escaped him: the time she spent on her cell phone, the messages she quickly deleted, the smiles that appeared without apparent explanation. None of this was enough to raise concrete suspicions, but it planted seeds of doubt in his mind. Despite this, he chose to ignore it. Maybe it was just a phase, I thought. Clara, on the other hand, made no effort to ease the tension. She felt torn between the affection she still had for David and the impulses of freedom that insisted on appearing. Sometimes, while they were together, she would look at him and feel guilty, but also confused. She loved her husband, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something in her life needed to change. A week before David's annual company party, he suggested they go together. It would be an opportunity to reconnect, to remember why they were together. Clara hesitated, but ended up agreeing, perhaps more out of politeness than out of desire. "It'll be good for us," he said, holding her hand in silent hope. In the days leading up to the event, David made a point of getting involved in the preparations. She chose an elegant suit, bought flowers for Clara and even arranged a dinner for the two of them before the party. He wanted to show that he was willing to do anything to rekindle the flame between them. Clara appreciated the gestures, but she couldn't help but feel a weight in each of them, as if they were attempts to mask something that was already broken. When the night of the party arrived, David was excited. He knew there was tension between them, but he was hopeful that this moment together could bring some of the magic back. Clara, however, was distant, although she tried to hide it. She got ready with care, put on a dress she knew David loved, but deep down her mind was somewhere else. Upon arriving at the party, David greeted colleagues enthusiastically, while Clara moved around the room with a polite smile. The hall was full, music was playing at a pleasant volume, and people were talking animatedly. David was close to Clara at first, but was soon pulled together by colleagues to talk about the company's projects and strategies. Clara was alone, observing the environment, until someone approached her. The man was charismatic and extroverted, the type who knew how to effortlessly attract attention. He greeted her warmly, and soon they were talking like old acquaintances. Clara felt something strange but familiar. It was as if a part of her, long dormant, had awakened. David, across the room, looked in their direction and saw the smile on Clara's face, a smile he hadn't seen in a long time. At the end of the night, as they were returning home, David tried to start a conversation, but Clara was introspective. He didn't ask about the man, even though he wanted to. He preferred to believe that it meant nothing, that it was just a casual interaction in a relaxed environment. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The following days were a mixture of silence and tension. David, no matter how much he tried to remain calm, could not shake the thoughts that haunted him. Clara, in turn, seemed increasingly absent, immersed in thoughts that he could not decipher. And so, unbeknownst to them, the life they had built together was beginning to shake like a house of cards about to collapse. The routine seemed to have resumed its usual course, but something was different in David and Clara's house. There was an underlying tension, like a taut rope about to snap. David, increasingly focused on work, tried to ignore the thoughts that insisted on occupying his mind. Nights, once a time of comfort and closeness, were now filled with uncomfortable silences or superficial conversations that went nowhere. Clara, in turn, was more agitated, her thoughts running in opposite directions. One day, while David was reviewing reports in his home office, Clara quickly came in to get something she had forgotten. She seemed distracted, her expression distant, but she forced herself to smile as she met his gaze. "I need to resolve some things downtown." "I won't be long," he said, leaving before David had time to respond. He tried not to think about it too much, but something in his tone left an uneasy feeling. Clara's trips to the center became frequent in the following weeks. David noticed, but decided not to question it. He wanted to believe it was something trivial, a new project, or just her desire to have some space. But doubt began to grow. One night, while Clara was away, he felt an impulse he had never experienced before. He took her cell phone, which was charging in the living room. He hesitated for a moment, fighting the feeling of invading his privacy, but curiosity and insecurity took over. Upon unlocking the device, David found himself in front of an almost empty screen. No compromising messages, no suspicious call logs. However, something caught his attention, a messaging app he had never seen before. His mind began to formulate hypotheses as he searched through the contacts and tried to find something that would justify the uneasiness he felt. But the app was clean, with no conversations saved. He put the cell phone back in its place, but the weight on his chest remained. Clara returned late that night, more excited than usual. He talked about ideas for events and future projects, but David just listened distractedly. He watched her, trying to find some clue in her gestures, in her voice. Nothing seemed obvious, but the feeling that something was wrong never left him. The following weekend, Clara mentioned an important event she needed to work on. "It's a very big client. It can open a lot of doors," she explained, while adjusting the dress she had just bought. David smiled, encouraging her, but inside, a silent distrust was growing. On Saturday night, while Clara went out with renewed confidence, David stayed at home. He tried to distract himself by watching a movie, but his mind kept wandering. Her absence was more noticeable than ever. Hours later, while organizing some papers, he found a forgotten note on the table. It was a receipt from an expensive restaurant, dated a week ago, on a day when Clara was supposedly working late. He frowned, feeling his heart speed up. He took out his cell phone and started typing the name of the restaurant, trying to find information. But before he could go any further, a message arrived. It was an automatic message sent by the transport app that Clara used to use. It indicated that it had just been dropped off at a nearby address. David stared at the message for long seconds, the blood rushing through his veins too quickly. He felt a mix of fear, anger, and determination. He took the car keys and left without thinking twice. As he drove through the silent streets, his heart was beating so hard that he could hear the sound in his ears. The location wasn't far, and he found himself trying to guess what he would find. Maybe it was just an important client, a professional dinner she hadn't mentioned. But a part of him knew he was clinging to flimsy excuses to avoid what he feared. When he arrived at the location, he parked the car on a nearby street and walked. The address was a small boutique hotel, discreet and almost hidden. He stood in front of the building for a few minutes, unable to move. Every possible scenario ran through his mind, but none of them seemed real. He entered, his heart heavy, and headed to the reception. The attendant looked at him curiously, but David tried to remain calm. "I'm looking for my wife. She came here and is probably with a work group," he said, trying to sound casual. The attendant hesitated, but before he could respond, David saw something that made the floor seem to disappear beneath his feet. Clara appeared in the lobby, laughing at something the man next to her had said. He was her boss. They didn't notice him right away, but when their eyes met, Clara's smile disappeared. "David," she said, surprised and apprehensive. The boss beside her looked uncomfortably, adjusting his posture. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but his voice sounded weak, devoid of its usual confidence. David didn't respond. He felt a mixture of emotions so intense that it was difficult to identify which one predominated. He just stood there, watching while Clara tried to explain. "It's not what it seems. We were just discussing some details of the project. Nothing beyond that." But David didn't need any more words. The expressions on their faces, the closeness, the way she looked away, everything was enough to confirm what he feared. He took a deep breath, fighting to maintain control. Without saying anything else, he turned and left, leaving Clara and the boss standing in the lobby, surrounded by awkward silence. When he returned to his car, he got behind the wheel, but was unable to start the engine immediately. He stood there, staring into space, while his mind processed what had just happened. The suspicions that had tormented him for weeks were now reality, and he felt as if a part of himself had been ripped away. Clara would look for him, he knew that. There would be explanations, apologies, perhaps even promises of change. But at that moment, all he wanted was distance. He needed to think, he needed to understand how his life had gotten to that point. Not knowing what the future held, David started the car and drove, his heart heavy, but determined to discover the truth behind the abyss that was now opening up in his life. David spent the night awake. The silence of their home seemed amplified, every corner filled with a mix of pain, anger, and disbelief. He tried to organize his thoughts, but everything was mixed together in a whirlwind of memories, doubts and hurt. Clara's face and that of her boss appeared repeatedly in his mind, like a photograph etched with fire. The betrayal was not just about the act itself, but about everything it represented, the breach of trust, the disregard for everything they had built together. The next day, Clara arrived early. He opened the door hesitantly, as if the simple act of entering was a challenge. David was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale but his posture rigid, indicating that he had spent the night waiting for this moment. "David," she began, her voice low and wavering. "I know we have to talk. Please listen to me." He looked up slowly, and the look he gave her was icy, cutting. "I'm listening," he replied, his voice almost a whisper, but carrying a weight that made Clara hesitate. She sat across from him, her hands restless on the table. He tried to start again, but the words seemed to escape him. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "I made a mistake," he said, tears beginning to well up in his eyes. "It was a moment of weakness, something I should never have let happen." "Weakness?" David leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Weakness doesn't last for weeks, Clara. Weakness does not involve dinners at expensive restaurants or nights in hotels. This was not a moment. That was a choice." She shuddered at the accusation. "I didn't want to hurt you," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt." David laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, without a hint of humor. "Clara, you destroyed everything. It's not just about hurting. It's about cheating, lying, betraying." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Do you have any idea what it's like to look at the person you love and realize they're not who you thought they were? That all this time you were living with a stranger?" His words hit her like a blow, but she knew he was right. There weren't enough excuses to justify what she had done, and she didn't even want to try. I don't know what to say," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "But you need to understand that, it wasn't about you. It was about me. About something that was wrong with me." David shook his head in disbelief. "Is that the best explanation you can offer? What was it about you? That somehow, I'm supposed to believe this has nothing to do with me?" He stood up, unable to remain seated. He began pacing around the kitchen, his mind buzzing with thoughts and memories. "I have always been here. I always did everything I could for you. And you, instead of telling me what was wrong, decided to find answers from someone else." Clara tried to reach for his hand, but he moved away. "Please give me a chance to explain," he begged. "I know I made a mistake, but this doesn't have to be the end. We can find a way to overcome this. I still love you. Do you love it?" He stopped and looked at her. "Love doesn't do that, Clara. Love doesn't lie. Love does not betray. What you feel is not love. It's guilt. And I don't want to be someone you love just because you feel guilty." Silence fell between them, thick and charged. Clara knew she needed to tell the truth, but each word felt like a weight she couldn't carry. David, noticing her hesitation, pressed her. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice lower now, but still firm. "Why did this happen? Why him?" She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "At first, it was just work," he began, his voice barely audible. He praised me, said things I hadn't heard in a long time. I felt seen, important. And me? David interrupted. Do you think I've never seen you? That I never valued you? Clara, I have been by your side all these years. How can you say it wasn't enough? I'm not saying you weren't enough, she replied, her voice finally gaining strength. I'm saying I didn't feel enough. It's not something you could fix. It was something in me, a dissatisfaction that I couldn't explain. David laughed again, but now there was something almost desperate in his laugh. So, to resolve your dissatisfaction, you decided to destroy our marriage? Clara, you knew what you were doing. You chose this. She nodded, unable to argue against the truth. Yes, I chose. And it was the worst choice of my life. But, David, I'm here now. I'm here because I want to fix this. He shook his head slowly. To repair. How do you fix something that was broken on purpose? How do you rebuild trust when the base has been destroyed? The two were silent for a long moment, the words hanging in the air like a sentence. Finally, Clara broke the silence. I know it may be too late to ask for forgiveness. But you deserve to know that I never wanted to lose you. I never wanted it to come to this. David looked at her, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman he married, the woman he loved. But the pain was stronger, deeper. Clara, he said finally, his voice cold and distant. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. And honestly, I don't know if I want to. She closed her eyes, feeling the gravity of his words. He knew that this could be the end of everything, but he also knew that, regardless of what happened, he needed to face the consequences of his actions. David left the kitchen, leaving Clara alone at the table. She stood there, lost in her thoughts, as his words echoed in her mind. And as the house fell into silence again, they both knew that the journey ahead would be long and painful. The wounds opened that morning would be difficult to close, and the path to any kind of resolution was still far from being found. David spent the rest of the day outside, trying to find a way out of the mess his life had become. He drove aimlessly through the streets, stopping at a park he used to visit in the early years of his marriage. He sat on a bench next to a small lake, watching the ripples in the water and feeling the weight of the decisions he would have to make. Clara, on the other hand, stayed at home, staring at the emptiness of the apartment. Every corner seemed steeped in memories, of moments that once made her smile but now filled her with regret. She knew David was hurt, knew that her words hadn't been enough to repair the damage. But what else could you do? She tried to rehearse a conversation in her head, searching for the perfect phrase, but it all sounded insufficient. Hours later, when night had already fallen, David finally returned home. He entered without making a sound, as if he didn't want to alert her to his arrival. But Clara, sitting on the living room sofa, immediately noticed his presence. She stood up cautiously, looking at him with a mix of hope and fear. David, can we talk? He asked, his voice barely audible. He stopped in the middle of the room, studying her for a moment. There was no longer anger in his eyes, but there was no heat either. I don't think there's much more to say, Clara. You already explained. Now it's up to me. Please, she insisted, taking a step towards him. I need you to listen to me, I really do. David sighed tiredly. He sat in an armchair, crossing his arms. Then speak. Clara hesitated for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. I know nothing I say will change what I did. But you need to know that it wasn't because I stopped loving you. It was never that. So what happened, Clara? Why did you put me in this position? He asked, without changing his tone, but with an intensity that made Clara look away. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words before speaking them. I was feeling lost. It wasn't something that happened suddenly. It accumulated, little by little, and I didn't even realize how far I was moving away from us. David shook his head, frustrated. And you thought the solution was to betray me? Is this what you do when you feel lost? I didn't want it to be like this. She exclaimed, her voice full of emotion. I just wanted to feel something different. Something that reminded me of who I was before. And in the middle of it all, I ended up forgetting who we were. What now? Asked David, leaning forward. Do you remember? Because I don't know who you are anymore. His words were like a blow, and Clara felt the tears flow freely. But before he could respond, David stood up abruptly. I need air. He left before she could protest, leaving her alone again. But this time, Clara knew she couldn't just wait. He got up, picked up his cell phone, and sent a brief message to David, please meet me at the park tomorrow. We have to finish this conversation. David saw the message when he was miles from home. He didn't respond, but I knew he would show up. Not because I thought they would resolve anything, but because I needed to end it definitively. The next morning, the sky was cloudy when Clara arrived at the park. She was anxious, each step heavy as she walked to the bench where they usually sat. David was already there, looking at the lake. He seemed distant, but not indifferent. Thank you for coming, Clara said, sitting down next to him. He didn't respond immediately. After a few moments, he said, I want to understand, Clara. I'm not saying I'll forgive, but I need to know. All. Without beating around the bush. Clara swallowed. It was now or never. It was, at work, he began, his voice wavering. He approached me when I was in a fragile moment. I should have refused, I should have talked to you, but I didn't. I thought I could control it, that it wouldn't go far. But I was stupid, David. I let that happen. David listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When she finished, he finally turned to her. And now? Is he still part of your life? No. It's over, Clara replied quickly. From the moment you found out, I ended everything. I don't want anything to do with him anymore. I just want to fix what I messed up between us. And how do you think that's possible? He asked, the pain evident in his voice. You expect me to just get over this? For us to pretend it never happened? I know it's not that simple, Clara admitted. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you, David. And I know that if you give me a chance, we can find a way. He laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. Do you really believe that? Because right now, I can't see anything but lies and deception. Clara leaned forward, holding his hands. I'm not asking you to trust me now. I know this will take time. I just want you to consider the possibility. David looked at her hands, then her face, and saw something he hadn't expected, sincerity. Still, the pain was overwhelming. I need time, Clara. To think. To decide if it's worth trying. She nodded, even though she knew that those words could mean the definitive end. I'll wait as long as it takes. They stood in silence, side by side, as the wind blew the leaves around them. It wasn't a new beginning, but it wasn't the end either. It was a suspended point, a necessary pause before the next step. Both knew that the journey would still be long and full of uncertainty, but for now, they were willing to try, each in their own way. The weeks that followed were marked by dense silence, interrupted only by practical and inevitable conversations. David still remained at home, but it was clear that he was becoming more and more distant. His nights were spent on long walks, returning late and always avoiding direct confrontation. Clara, on the other hand, did her best to rebuild something, even if she wasn't sure how. The house felt smaller, suffocating, and the void between them was like an invisible wall separating them. David started going to a cafe close to work. It was a silent refuge where he would spend hours after work, reflecting on everything that had happened. On one of these nights, he was approached by a woman who was sitting at the next table. She looked hesitant, but smiled kindly. You look lost, he commented, his voice calm but curious. David looked up, surprised by the intrusion, but didn't feel uncomfortable. It's more complicated than that, he replied, without elaborating. The woman nodded, as if she understood he wasn't willing to share more. Still, he continued, sometimes complicated things just need a little clarity. David didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of relief. They exchanged a few words before she said goodbye, and he realized he hadn't asked her name. Meanwhile, Clara was increasingly consumed by a desperate effort to win David back. She started planning small gestures, preparing dinner, reviving old habits that brought them closer together. One night, she put together an album with photos of the two of them over the years, leaving it on the living room table. When David arrived, he noticed the album but just looked at it before heading to his room without saying a word. Clara felt the tears rising, but she held them back, determined to keep trying. On a particularly cold night, David returned home early. He found Clara in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a pan on the stove. The silence between them was almost palpable, but this time, David decided to break it. "Clara, we need to talk." She turned quickly, surprised. "Of course. About whatever you want." David took a deep breath before starting. "I've been thinking a lot about all of this. About us. And honestly, I don't know if I can move forward like you want." Her response was immediate. "I don't expect you to decide everything now, David. I know that what I did cannot be erased. But I'm here, willing to do anything so that we can start over." He shook his head, his face heavy with tiredness. "But I don't know if starting over is possible. Every time I look at you, all I can remember is the pain. And that's not fair to you or me." Clara approached slowly, her hands shaking. "I know you're hurt, and I know there's no guarantee we'll get through this. But I believe in us, David. And I'm willing to fight for us, even if you can't yet." "But for how long, Clara?" he asked, his voice slightly broken. "How long do you think you can fight alone before you realize there may be nothing left to save?" The question remained in the air, unanswered. Clara knew he was right, but she also knew she couldn't give up so easily. She returned to the stove, stirring the pot just to have something to do, something to occupy her hands while her mind struggled to process the weight of this conversation. The next morning, David returned to the cafe. To his surprise, the same woman from the previous night was there. She smiled when she saw him, and this time he was the one who started the conversation. "I didn't think I'd see her again. And I thought you needed some other unsolicited advice," she teased, pulling out the chair next to him. The two began to talk more openly, and David, for the first time, shared some details about his situation. He didn't mention Clara directly, but he described the betrayal, the hurt, and the feeling of being caught between the desire to forgive and the inability to forget. "Sometimes the pain is so great that you think it will never go away," the woman said, her tone serious. "But it's not about forgetting. It's about deciding what's worth keeping, even through the pain." Her words stuck in David's mind for the rest of the day. He started thinking about what he really wanted. It was difficult to imagine a life without Clara, but it was also difficult to imagine a life with her without feeling the constant shadow of what had happened. He knew he needed to make a decision, but he was paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. Clara, in turn, began to realize that David's silence was more than just hurt. He was moving away, and she didn't know how to bring him back. In a last-ditch effort, she decided to write him a letter. He spent hours trying to find the right words, rewriting passages, tearing out pages. When he finally finished, he left the letter on the table before going for a walk. When David returned home that night, he found the letter. He sat down on the couch and began to read, feeling each word as a blow but also as a desperate plea for reconciliation. Clara wrote about the love she still felt for him, about the mistakes she had made, and about the hope that they could somehow find a way back to each other. After finishing, David sat, holding the letter in his hands. He knew he couldn't ignore her efforts, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed actions, time, and, above all, he needed to find out if there was still something inside him capable of forgiving. The two were at a crossroads, each battling their own demons, but also the reality that the road to any kind of resolution would be long and uncertain. And, as night fell upon them once again, the future remained as hazy as the doubts that consumed them. David stood in front of the living room window, watching the lights of the neighboring building flicker in the distance. Clara had left to give him space, something that seemed to become more and more frequent in recent weeks. He held the letter she had written, now crumpled from folding and unfolding as he reread the words. The pain was still there, like an open wound that he knew wouldn't heal any time soon, but for the first time, he felt something else, clarity. That same night, he decided to send a message to Clara asking her to come home. She arrived hesitantly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. David was sitting at the kitchen table, the place where so many difficult conversations had taken place. When she entered, he motioned for her to sit down. "We need to wrap this up," he began, his voice firm but not aggressive. Clara didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "I spent weeks trying to understand what I feel, what I can still feel after all this. The truth, Clara, is that I can no longer look at you in the same way." His words were like a blow. She felt the air drain from her lungs, but she didn't stop. "I really wanted to find a way to put this behind me, but every moment I spend with you is like reliving the betrayal. And that's not fair to me or you." Clara shook her head slowly, tears flowing uncontrollably. "David, I know I hurt you. I know what I did is unforgivable, but I can't accept that this is the end. We have history, we have love, and I believed we could get through this." "Love is not enough when trust has been destroyed," he replied, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "I loved you, Clara. I loved it deeply. But I can't live trapped in what no longer exists. We both deserve better than this." Clara looked down, tears falling onto her clasped hands. "I knew he was being honest, and deep down, I knew he was right. But accepting the end was harder than anything I had ever faced." "So that's it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Are you leaving?" David took a deep breath before responding. "Yes. I'm going to leave here, leave this space for you. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I need to start over. Away from all that." The next day, David packed his things and left the house. Clara was left alone in the apartment, every object around her seeming to scream the memories of what they had lived together. The days that followed were lonely and painful. She threw herself into her work, trying to find some sense of purpose amid the emptiness she felt. But the nights were the worst, when the silence in the house became deafening. David, on the other hand, found solace in the walks he took so often. He spent hours exploring new places, searching for meaning in his new reality. On one of these walks, he met the woman from the cafe again. This time, he was the one who approached her. They talked for hours, and he began to realize that there was something comforting in the simplicity of their connection. It was not a replacement for what he had lost, but a new opportunity to rediscover himself. Months passed, and Clara finally decided she needed closure. He sent a message to David, asking to meet. He accepted, and the two met in a park where so many important conversations had taken place. She seemed calmer, more resolute, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. "I wanted to see you to say that I understand your decision," said Clara, breaking the silence. "It was hard to accept, but I realized you were right. We both need to move on." David smiled, a wistful but sincere smile. "I'm glad you see this now. It wasn't an easy decision for me either." "I know," she replied, looking at the floor. "And I wanted to thank you. For everything we were, for everything you taught me. Even if it ended like this, I will never forget what we experienced." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Neither do I. The two said goodbye there, knowing that it was the end of the story they had shared. Clara returned to work, eventually finding new purpose in projects that made her feel alive again. David continued to explore his new life, building a stronger connection with the woman he met at the cafe, someone who helped him see the world with new eyes. The past has not disappeared for either of them. The wounds healed over time, but the scars remained as reminders of what they had lost. However, in the midst of pain, both found ways to start over, to rebuild their lives with new meanings. And, in the end, the love they once shared was not erased, but transformed into a learning experience that took them to places they never imagined. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. Here, our goal is to show how choices can impact lives in profound and unexpected ways. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.